Thank you very much, sir, for holding this very interesting panel on the topic of fundamental right, not to be framed. My eminent panelists before me have spoken about various ways in which the right not to be framed is located within our legal system. So I am going to try and attempt to do four things. First is, again, I try and locate the right not to be framed within the Indian legal framework. I will then look at mechanisms to deal with the cases of framing. Third, I'll try and do a quick comparative view, looking at the US, for instance, on how their laws deal with this issue. And lastly, something that Mr. Hemachandran just discussed, safeguards to ensure that framing doesn't happen, and also to also raise a question that he also discussed as to why does framing even take place. Now, again, as Justice Naik already pointed out, Article 21 is, as all of us know, the source of this right not to be framed by the state, because 21 very clearly says that no person can be deprived of his right to life or personal liberty except as per procedure established by law. When the procedure established by law itself is violated and the person's liberty or life is taken away, that would definitely be a violation of Article 21. Although not expressly using the term framing, I think it implicitly articulated within Article 21 that there is a right not to be framed by the state. So, in this context, I'd like to look at a few provisions in the procedural laws, especially to try and locate the right not to be framed. And I think I would say that the entire pre-trial process, the pre-trial rights that we see in the CRPC are actually a charter to ensure that the state does not frame people. We have looked at it also as rights of the accused person, but also at the same time, I would see it as a charter to ensure that people do not get framed. Importantly, what the pre-trial provisions also do is that they place the onus on the judiciary, on the magistracy, to ensure that the state functionaries are not going beyond the role given to them under these sections and are not framing individuals that have been brought before them. And so magistrates have a very important role at multiple points at the pre-trial stage to enforce these rights. For instance, to say section 159 of the CRPC or section 167, subsection 2, even during the remand process in the CRPC, once the charge sheet is filed under section 173 of the CRPC, and even during taking cognizance under section 190 of the CRPC, it's an important role that the magistrates play in this context. The other place where we can see the safeguards that the CRPC provides, and we see discussion of this not only in the 1973 CRPC, but we also see discussions about this in the Constituent Assembly when Articles 20, 21, and 22 were being discussed in the Constituent Assembly, that the Constituent Assembly had a concern that the liberty of individuals is not taken away. So, for instance, Section 100 of the CRPC provides various safeguards with respect to search in this context, and two important things that Section 100 does, which then sort of gets taken into various statutes where search provisions come in, is to have independent witnesses to the search. Second, preparing of a seizure memo and having that seizure memo attested by independent witnesses. The case law on Section 100 very clearly articulates that this is to ensure that no planting of evidence takes place, which in other words is framing. So hence there's a recognition within Section 100 of the CRPC that there is a right not to be framed, and these safeguards are accordingly provided. The one concern that I do have about the manner in which Section 100 has been interpreted by courts is that or any of these safeguards have been interpreted by courts has unfortunately taken place in context of so-called emergency provisions, be it like we discussed earlier, TADA, UAPA, and others. And in those contexts, courts have said that unless the accused or unless the person whose person or property has been searched is able to show prejudice, even if there's an illegal procedure, that's fine, as long as you show that so that the onus is put on the person to show that there was prejudice. And so this prejudice standard does end up weakening the safety the CRPC itself provides. At the same time, we also, through our case law, have permitted admissibility of illegally obtained evidence. Again, common law countries, a lot of countries have done that, and that also, I think, is one of the sources where framing can definitely take place. In the CRPC, again, we have section 162 of the CRPC, where statements made to police officers have been inadmissible, although there have been calls to change that section. That has not happened, which still shows that this is an important safeguard. Again, in the Evidence Act, we have sections 24, 25, and 26 in the context of confessions, 25 with respect to confessions to police officers, 24 confessions taken using threats and other measures, and 26 of confession made by a person in the custody of a police officer. However, we do recognize that we have Section 27 of the Indian Evidence Act, which provides the exception to these sections. And I'd like to deal with 27 just briefly, looking at two separate lines of argument on Section 27. One is, can you make a discovery if that discovery comes out by violating a person's fundamental rights? And three important cases in this context of the Supreme Court. One is the case of Katikalu Ogad, the celebrated case where the Supreme Court held that if you violate a person's Article 20 Clause 3 rights and extract a statement, then not only is the confession not inadmissible, but any discovery made on that basis of that compelled statement is also not inadmissible, is also inadmissible. And this was reiterated by Justice Krishna Iyer in Nandini Satpathy. And more recently, in the context of the so-called truth serum, narco analysis test, and brain mapping test, in the Selvi case, the Supreme Court also said that if a person is compelled to make a statement when in custody, neither direct or derivative use of this statement is permitted, because this would violate Article 20 Clause 3. And in 2019, the Supreme Court in Ashish Jain versus Makran Jain reiterated the Selvi case, and more cases also in the recent past, saying that you cannot make use of a fact that you have so-called discovered in the 27 by violating a person's fundamental rights. All of these have dealt with Article 20 Clause 3, but surely this also extends to Article 21. So therefore, I think that there is that issue with 27, and also therefore 27 does remain a loophole, and we need to give serious thought as to how the section should be interpreted going forward to ensure that the protection of rights of citizens as well as the safeguard against framing. So this is in the context of the Evidence Act and the CRPC. Now we've discussed, like Justice Chandrashwar himself discussed, we end up talking about so-called high-profile cases when we talk about framing. But framing is a reality for a lot of people under two legislations. And I mean, there may be more, but in my experience, one is the NDPS Act and the second is the Arms Act. In the NDPS Act, you have Section 50. Section 50 of the NDPS Act is an important safeguard in that act in order to prevent planting. It essentially says that a police officer, when searching a person suspected to have a narcotic drug on their person, is to tell them that they have a right to be searched by a gazetted officer. And if that person wants to be searched by a gazetted officer, they should be taken to the nearest gazetted officer and searched by such gazetted officer. In my experience, looking at cases of all NDPS cases of people who are in custody in Tihar jail in Delhi, this is something that we're looking the Delhi High Court. It seems surprising that nearly 97% of individuals claim to say that they don't want to be searched. They want to be searched by police officers and not by a gazetted officer. And when you look at these seizure memos, you very clearly see that they were never told about it. So it's not that they didn't say that they don't want to be searched, but in most cases they were never told by police officers that they have this right, whatever comes of it, but it's not being followed at all. Even the wording of the section is not being followed. And with all of these cases, since we have NDPS special courts, it's a matter of concern that if all of these cases are coming up before the same judge in an NDPS court, and that judge is looking at a particular way, it seems also curious. It is something that if you read case law, if a particular jurisdiction, you see that everybody who wants to smuggle a drug seems to want to go to a particular area and is always apprehended around a particular bridge. So if you as a judge seeing the same facts across multiple cases, should it not trigger in your mind that there's something happening here? Similarly, in the case of the Arms Act, Section 25 Arms Act, a provision very regularly used, a draconian provision, which says that if you are in possession of arms which are prohibited under that act, which could include a knife, punishment was the minimum punishment of 1 year was what the act said. In 2019, it was amended to make it a minimum punishment of 2 years. And the Arms Act says that if a police officer sees someone walking around suspiciously and it appears that the person has arms on them, that person can be arrested. Again, I worked at the National Judicial Academy in Bhopal, and having seen a lot of Arms Act cases in Bhopal, in the Bhopal courts as a part of different study, what we found, so Mohan Gopal and Justice Lokur both would know this because we've discussed in the past, that everyone who sort of hit every case that was coming up said that there was an informer who told the police officer that this person suspiciously standing under the so-called Chetak Bridge in Bhopal with a knife inside his trouser. And like I said, in the NDPS context, these people seem to want to come and stand under this railway underbridge with arms with them, and so therefore you had this huge array of people. Again, if you look at the NCRT statistics, you will see that the city of Bhopal has the highest number of Arms Act cases under Section 25 Arms Act, a huge number. And so then it seems to appear from all of this that there is something happening which is not true. And you, of course, you speak to police officers, they'll tell you that, yeah, we are planting these knives, we are planting these drugs for some other reason. I'm not able to find this kind of element who I want in prison, but I can't find any criminal statute, so why not plant using statutes which make possession an offense? So we need to think about how the safeguards that these laws provide are ensured that people are not framed for something that they never did. Now, coming to the next point on the mechanisms to deal with cases of framing. Of course, we had the famous case of Nambi Narayanan versus State of Kerala, involving the so-called ISRO spying a case where the Supreme Court, in awarding compensation to Mr. Nambi Narayanan, says in the judgment that suffering, anxiety, and treatment, like I think one of my previous panelists mentioned already, suffering, anxiety, and treatment, which the sense of life and liberty and Article 21 withers away, needs to be compensated, recognizing of the fact that the impact that framing has on innocent people and their families. And Justice Deepak Mishra also cites the case, multiple cases to say that reputation of an individual is an inseparable facet of the right to dignity. So therefore, Nambi Narayanan, as well as the Adambai case with Justice Patnaik already discussed, is an indication of the recognition of that framing violates Article 21 of the Constitution, which brings a claim for compensation. Also, although India has a reservation to the ICCPR, saying that the Indian legal system does not recognize the right to compensation for victims of unlawful arrest and detention, subsequent judicial decisions have recognized the claim for compensation, going sort of against India's reservation to the ICCPR. The Law Commission of India, in its 277 report on wrongful prosecutions, discusses the case law on malicious prosecution in detail, and Chapter 4 of that report is worth reading because it brings all of this case law together, citing cases like Khatri versus State of Bihar, Rudal Shah versus State of Bihar, Lilavati Behra as well as D.K. Basu versus the state of West Bengal. Also recognizing, however, both case law as well as the law commission does this, that there's no express provision for payment of compensation for violation of a person's fundamental rights by state functionaries. And it has been done on a case-to-case basis. So we need to probably have some legal framework to deal with these issues. The Law Commission also refers to remedies under the criminal law, some of which Justice Patnaik already mentioned. We have Section 167 in the IPC, which deals with a public servant framing an incorrect document with intent to cause injury. The Law Commission refers to a case decided by the District Court in Dwarka in New Delhi about prosecution of police officers who had framed innocent persons in a criminal case under Section 167. The prosecution of these officers was under Section 167 of the IPC, but the cases far and few and far between. So therefore, the usage of these provisions needs to be done more regularly when framing actually happens. Similarly, we have Section 211 of the IPC, where it talks about false charges of offence made by public servants and others with the intent to injure. Then we have Section 218 of the IPC, where a public servant frames an incorrect record that is an offence. This would include, through case law says, manipulations of case diaries, for instance. So that way, it is broader than Section 167 actually says. Three other sections. One is Section 219 of the IPC, which deals more with judicial proceedings and malicious acts during judicial proceedings, and then Section 220 of the IPC dealing with commitment to confinement by a person having authority knowing that he is acting contrary to law. So situations like even the Kafil Dr. Khan situation that Justice Lokur mentioned could possibly attract Section 220 of the IPC, because you could argue that due care and attention as required by Section 52 of the IPC was not taken in some of these contexts. So therefore, there are sufficient provisions, there seem to be sufficient provisions in the IPC to indicate that persons have the right not to be framed, and the act of framing is punishable under the Indian Penal Code. To also look at the statutory framework in the US, the US federal framework under the civil rights mechanism, there is a section of the 42 US Code, Section 1983, which basically provides the right of a person to get compensation if a constitutional right of that person has been violated. Although the context is very different and may not be similar at all to the context that we're talking about in India, and it is very complex, and there will be complex case law in this context. I thought it would be useful to mention this framework and a recent judgment of the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Manuel versus the city of Joliet. Interesting facts here that this African American man was pulled over in a traffic stop. These police officers found some yellow-colored tablets on it, which he claimed were vitamins. They said it was drugs. They did a field test, discovered it was not. They did it once more, discovered it was not. Again, that it was not a drug. They still take him to the police station. There, they do a test again, discover it is still not a drug, but make a report saying they found drugs on it. And then they take him to the prosecutor, saying that they found drugs, who then takes him to the judge. Judge takes judicial notice, and he is then in custody for the next 7 weeks. When the tablet goes to the crime lab, they discover again it's a vitamin, it is not a drug. And so therefore, this case comes up before the US Supreme Court on the question of whether a person has a right to be compensated under this statute in the context of violation of the Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution. Basically interpreting seizure as arrest of that person. It's an interesting judgment to read, which is authored by Justice Kagan of the US Supreme Court. Ultimately, the final point I'd like to make, again, something that Mr. Hemachandran dealt with, is why framing and what are the safeguards? I think there are three situations which literature talks about and criminologists talk about why framing does occur. One is incentive structures. We have known of states which give their prosecutors points. I remember a couple of years back, there was a state which it made a mobile app asking prosecutors to log in their convictions, etc., in an app and gave points to them based on how many convictions that they had. And similar incentive structures for police, pushing them to apprehend and convict people for particular offences, even if those people are innocent. So I think we need to target this sort of incentive. What incentive structures will push state functionaries to frame people? The second is tunnel vision, where people are convinced that a particular person has committed an offense, and just and the tunnel vision go behind that a person, investigate and prosecute accordingly. At the end, to find out that that person had nothing to do with the offense. Um, some of it may be in good faith, some of it may be in bad faith. So we need to look at those. And of course, a question of state interference in investigation, abuse of power, and corruption is the third thing that leads to framing and political prosecution, stifling of dissent, etc. So we need structures, mechanisms like Mr. Hemchandran already mentioned to take care of these issues, and we should be careful to ensure that these mechanisms kick in right at the FIR stage or right at any stage of detention. And we don't wait till that person is acquitted. If the person goes through the entire criminal justice system, reaches the Supreme Court, like in the Adambai case, and then you discover that the person was actually innocent, and then becomes then kicks in the entire system of malicious prosecution, Article 21, public law remedy, or any of these IPC section. So we need to disengage framing from just acquittals after a complete trial. In the Nambi Narayanan case, if I'm not wrong, there was a one-man committee headed by a former Supreme Court judge set up to look at some of these issues. I'm not sure what happened thereafter. I think it's time for us to look into this issue from a broader context to see what sort of structures we need to set in place. Like the UK seems to have a commission which looks at cases on a regular basis. I think we have enough safeguards within our magistracy itself, not going up to the High Court or Supreme Court, within our magistracy itself, to be able to do this, like I said earlier, even at the stage of remand or at the stage of cognizance, so that situations where it appears that a person seems to have been failed are immediately weeded out, and steps are taken for accountability of people who have of officials who have framed individuals in bad faith. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.